Till now we have seen how can we execute threads using the executor service. But something seems not complete. In all the examples that we have seen so far, we are not returning anything. What if we want to return something from the thread execution? How can we do that? Let's learn about the same. So here I have created a class. This is called as Callable demo, and we have a class for the task which is implementing the runnable interface. And inside the run method that we have overridden, I'm trying to return something. Well, of course it's giving some compilation error because at the moment there is no way in which I could return some value from this method. Why so? So let's go to the runnable interface, and what we see here is that the runnable interface has just one method which is run, and it's returning a void. That means we cannot return anything. So what is the solution? So if we want to return anything from a thread, the way to do this is implement the callable interface. So callable is another interface provided in Java, and the way it works is that you implement this interface, and it's a generic based class, so you'll have to pass the generics of what exactly you want to return. So let's say that I want to return an integer, so I'll pass the same. And now let's get rid of this one and see what are my implementation options. So like we had run in the case of runnable, in the case of callable we have call, and here whatever you provide in the generics, the same thing is applied here, that is the integer. And let's say I want to return 12, so now this 12 should be returned whenever I'm going to run this thread. But now this part of the code starts to give some error. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that executor service provides two ways in which we can execute or submit threads to the executor service. One is the execute, other is the submit. So let's replace this with the submit, and now this should work fine. So what submit expects us is to pass either a runnable or a callable. So even if you want to pass a runnable, that is fine with submit, and for callable anyway you have to use the submit method itself, because you cannot submit a callable by using the execute method. So now that we have called the .submit on the executor service, what does it return? Should it return an integer? Let's find it out. So what we see here is that this thing is going to return a future. So what is a future? Future is again a class which is generic based, and in this case, since we were returning an integer, it's going to supply this integer value over here, and using the result we can do a couple of things, and one of those things is calling the .get method on this result. So let's print it out, and it's giving some error. Reason is that it is expecting us to either add a catch clause or maybe surround with try catch. So for now maybe I'll just add the exception method to the signature. So now let's run this code and find out what is the outcome. So yes, indeed it's going to return the value, that is 12, and this is how we are supposed to make use of callable if we want to return some value from a thread execution. But there are a few things we should be mindful of while using the callable interface and calling the .get method on the future class. Let's learn about the same. So what we have here is the main thread. So assume that this line is the main thread execution, and then at some point of time you created a callable and then you did a submission of that callable. So once that callable is submitted to the thread pool, you will immediately get a future of the type of the generics for the callable that you have implemented. And using the future object, sometime down the execution you could call future.get. So what happens is future is a placeholder, and it's empty till the time the processing is not completed by your thread, and that time could be anything depending on the execution that you have in your code, right? So let's say at this point of time you called future.get and the future did not have the final calculated value. So what happens? Please note that future is a blocking operation. What it means is that if you call future and if there is no value inside the future, then your entire main thread execution will be blocked. So whatever was being executed by the main thread, that will be entirely blocked. Let's say at some point of time the future got the value, so you will be able to get the value from here, and then the execution will resume or start. So this is one thing that you should always keep in mind while making use of the future.get call. So now let's demonstrate the same thing. Let's give another print statement. Let's call this as main thread execution completed. Let's run this. So we can see that the result is pretty much instantaneous. So we are getting a result as soon as possible. Now let's put some sleep in this thread. So let's call thread.sleep. Maybe let's have a sleep timer of 5 seconds. And with this, let's try to execute this one more time. So we are waiting. There is no result as of now. So just after 5 seconds, once the execution got completed, then we see this line that main thread execution completed. So basically what we did was we introduced some sort of latency in the call method, and when we called result.get, since the future did not have the result populated for this, so the main thread was blocked, and as soon as this future got its value, the value was printed and the execution continued. So is there any workaround for this behavior? So result.get has an overloaded method with this signature where you could pass in the timeout. So what this will do is it will wait for a certain time before giving a timeout exception, and in that time duration, if the future does not have the value, it will throw an exception and move ahead in the execution. Otherwise, if you get the value in that timeout, it will work as expected. So let's try the same. Here it's expected that this call method will be taking 5 seconds to run. So let's try to put a timeout of 1 second. And let's pass the time unit of second. This thing throws an exception. Let's handle that. Now let's run it one more time. After 1 second, it could not find the result, and then it threw an exception, that is the timeout exception, and it ended the execution. So if you don't want to end the execution this abruptly and probably continue with your execution, you could handle this exception in some other manner so that the execution of your main thread continues. Now let's increase this value to 6 seconds and find out the result. So now, since we have provided a timeout of 6 seconds and this thread needs 5 seconds to complete, the execution got completed, and then we had this message printed on the console, that is main thread execution completed. So this is good, but is there any other way in which we could handle the futures? So there are 3 important methods that we should know. The first one is future.cancel, and it expects us to pass a true or false. So let's say if I pass true, then let's say what exactly does it mean. So this value is may interrupt if running. So if you pass true, then let's say if the thread is running, then in that case it may get interrupted. If you pass false, then it will not be interrupted. So this is about the .cancel method. The next thing is future.isCancelled, and this returns a boolean. So using this, you can check in your code that the given future is it cancelled or not, and based on that you could implement certain functionality in your class. There is another important method which is called as isDone. So it's result.isDone, and this again results into a boolean value, and what it signifies is that whatever thread was being executed has that completed. Please note that this will return true for both the cases where the thread is going to run successfully and return some value, and in those cases as well wherein the thread is getting interrupted or maybe exiting out due to certain error or exceptions. This is the way in which we can make use of the callable interface, and based on your use case, you can use either runnable or callable to implement threads in Java.